The snow was falling in great white sheets across the Montana Territory when Ellen Hurst stumbled off the ridge trail and saw the smoke rising from the chimney of the Hartwell Ranch. And she told herself that she did not care if the man inside shot her on sight, because freezing to death alone in the dark was the only other option she had left. It was the winter of 1882, and the territory was the kind of cold that swallowed horses whole, that cracked wagon wheels straight through their iron rims, that made men question every choice they had ever made that led them so far from civilization. Ellen had been walking for the better part of 2 days, first from the town of Cutter's Creek, which was 40 miles back down the mountain pass, and then along a route that no sensible person would have attempted in November with nothing but a wool coat that had seen better days and a pair of boots with a sole coming loose on the left foot. She was 26 years old, and she had arrived in Cutter's Creek 6 weeks prior as the intended bride of a man named Douglas Fenwick. And Douglas Fenwick had taken one look at her when she stepped off the stagecoach, given a short little laugh that she would remember until the day she died, and said that she was not what he had been led to expect. He had taken back the ring he had sent her by post and told the assembled men of the town, right there in the street with the dust still settling around the coach wheels, that the deal was off. He had then walked into the saloon and not looked back once. Ellen had stood in that street with her single leather traveling case and the ruins of what she had believed was her future, and she had understood with the clarity that only complete humiliation can bring that she was entirely alone. She had no family left to return to. Her mother had died the previous spring in Cincinnati, and the money from the sale of their modest house had gone to paying her mother's doctor bills, her passage west, and the modest trousseau she had assembled at Douglas Fenwick's written request. She had perhaps $3.40 in her purse, a change of clothes, a small Bible, and a locket containing a portrait of her mother. The people of Cutter's Creek had not been unkind exactly, but they had not been kind either. A woman without a man, without money, without family, and without a reputation that could survive the public spectacle of being turned away by her intended, in 1882, in a frontier town, was what the territory called a ruined woman, not ruined by any action of her own, not ruined by sin or weakness or wrongdoing, simply ruined, the way a bridge gets ruined when the river rises too high and washes out the boards, the way a crop gets ruined by a late frost. It just happens, and after it happens, people step around the wreckage carefully and try not to look too long. She had spent 3 weeks working in the back of the laundry run by a Chinese man named Mr. Fen and his wife, who were among the few people in town who had offered her any genuine courtesy. They had paid her a small wage and allowed her to sleep in the back room on a cot behind a curtain. She had been grateful for every day of it, but Mr. Fenn's laundry was a precarious enterprise in a town that treated its Chinese residents with a casual cruelty that Ellen found deeply shameful. In late October, a group of men who considered themselves the upstanding citizens of Cutter's Creek had decided that Mr. Fenn's business was competition they did not want, and the laundry had been shut down through a combination of threats and a fire that started in the alley at night and consumed the back room where Ellen slept. She had escaped through a window with her traveling case and her wool coat and nothing else. Mr. Fenn and his wife had been given 48 hours to leave the territory. Ellen had stood at the edge of town and watched them load their remaining possessions onto a borrowed wagon with the same quiet dignity that she had admired in them from the first day. She walked into their shop, and she had felt a grief and a rage that mixed together into something that had no proper name. She had shaken Mrs. Fenn's hand, and Mrs. Fenn had pressed something into her palm, a small folded piece of paper, and told her in her careful, measured English that there was a ranch to the north, a man named Hartwell who had never turned away a person in need, and that the note explained the trail. The note had guided her through the first 20 miles. After that, the snow had come and buried the trail markers under 4 inches of white silence, and Ellen had been navigating by the shape of the ridgeline and the position of the moon when she could see it through the clouds, and pure obstinate refusal to lie down and give up. She reached the ranch gate at what she estimated was close to 10 o'clock at night. There was a carved wooden sign above the gate that read Hartwell in thick letters, the wood dark and weathered. Beyond the gate she could see a barn, a large main house with warm yellow light spilling from 2 windows, and several outbuildings that disappeared into the dark. The gate was not locked. She pushed it open, walked up the path to the front door of the house, and knocked 3 times with a fist that had lost most of its feeling an hour ago. There was a pause of perhaps 10 seconds. Then the door swung open and Ellen Hurst got her first look at Albert Hartwell. He was a large man, broader across the shoulders than the doorframe comfortably accommodated, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples and a beard that had not been trimmed in what appeared to be several weeks. He was wearing a heavy flannel shirt and canvas trousers, and he was holding a lantern in one hand and what appeared to be a worn leather-bound book in the other, which told her he had been reading, which surprised her. His eyes were very dark and very direct, and they moved over her quickly in the way that a person who has spent a long time reading weather and terrain learns to assess a situation fast. He took in the snow on her coat, the ice in her hair, the left boot with the flapping sole, the leather case she was holding in a death grip, and the color of her face, which she imagined was somewhere between pale and blue. He said, "Sit down and eat before you explain." He stepped back from the door and gestured with the lantern at the interior of the house, and Ellen Hurst, who had spent 6 weeks building up a very reasonable set of reservations about accepting help from strangers in the territory, walked inside without a moment's hesitation. The house was the warmest place she had been since Cincinnati. There was a fireplace in the main room large enough to stand inside, and it was burning well with a split log fire that threw orange light across a room that was spare but not uncomfortable. There was a rough-hewn table with 4 chairs, a large iron stove against one wall, shelves of books and tools and tins of provisions, a rack with several coats and a pair of snowshoes, and a rug on the floor that had once been a bearskin and still retained enough of its original mass to cover a substantial portion of the plank flooring. Against the far wall was a rocking chair, and beside it a small table with the lamp that had been burning in the window and another book lying open, spine up. Albert Hartwell hung his lantern on a hook by the door, set his book on the shelf without losing the page, and moved to the iron stove with the efficient economy of motion of a man who lives alone and has arranged his life to require as little wasted movement as possible. He lifted the lid of a pot that was sitting to the side of the stove keeping warm, and the smell that rose from it, beef and onion and something with herbs, hit Ellen so hard that her knees actually bent slightly before she caught herself. "There's a chair," he said, nodding at the table. "Sit in it." She sat. She set her traveling case beside her feet, and she folded her hands on the table because they were shaking, and she did not entirely want him to see that. She looked at the fire, and the fire was so beautiful and so warm that she felt the backs of her eyes sting in a way she was not going to allow, not now, not in front of a stranger. He set a bowl in front of her, thick with stew, and then a plate of cornbread cut in rough squares, and then a tin mug of coffee that was so hot the steam rose in a column and warmed her face before she even picked it up. He sat down across from her with his own bowl, and he ate, and he did not look at her with pity, and he did not ask her a single question, and Ellen Hurst ate the best meal she had consumed in 6 weeks in complete and absolute silence. She ate 2 full bowls of the stew and 3 pieces of cornbread. She drank the coffee, and he refilled her mug without being asked. When she finally set down her spoon, she felt the warmth of the food spreading through her from the inside, and she felt the shaking in her hands ease, and she felt, for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach in Cutter's Creek, like she might actually survive. Albert Hartwell sat back in his chair and regarded her across the table with those dark, direct eyes. "When you're ready," he said. She told him. She told him all of it, not because she owed him the entire story, but because something about the directness of him, the way he had simply opened the door and fed her without making her beg for it, had loosened something in her chest that had been wound very tight for a very long time. She told him about Douglas Fenwick and the street in Cutter's Creek, and the laundry and Mr. and Mrs. Fenn, and the fire and the note, and the 2-day walk through the snow. She told him in a level voice, looking at the table or at the fire or occasionally at his face, which remained attentive and still throughout. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Fenwick's a coward and a fool, and what was done to the Fenn family is a wrong that will sit on this territory for a long time." He paused. "You can have the room at the end of the hall for as long as you need it. There's work here if you want it. I run this ranch with one hired hand man named Cobb who comes up from his place about 2 miles south every morning. The work is real work and I pay fair wages. You don't have to decide anything tonight." Ellen looked at him across the table. "Why?" she said. He seemed to consider the question seriously. "Because you knocked on my door in a snowstorm and you ate what I put in front of you without complaint, and you told me your situation plainly without asking me to feel sorry for you. That's enough for me." She nodded once. "Ellen Hurst," she said, and offered her hand across the table. He shook it. His hand was very large and very warm, and the grip was careful, as though he was aware of the difference in size and did not want to hurt her. "Albert Hartwell," he said. She slept that night on a real bed with a quilt that smelled of cedar and clean air, and she slept without dreaming for the first time in weeks. And when she woke in the gray, early light of a Montana November morning and heard the sounds of the stove being fed in the other room, she lay still for a long moment and let herself feel the strangeness of being safe. And then she got up and went to see what there was to do. There was a great deal to do. Albert Hartwell's ranch sat on 400 acres at the base of the eastern slope of a range that had no formal name on any map Ellen had ever seen, though Albert called it the gray wall in the way that people who live close to a thing eventually give it their own private name. He ran cattle, a modest herd of about 80 head, and a small operation in horses that he bred for mountain use, strong-legged and sure-footed animals that were apparently sought after by ranchers and mining outfits throughout the territory. He had a kitchen garden that was dormant now under the snow, but which, from the evidence of a root cellar stocked with preserved vegetables, had been productive. He had a smokehouse and a well and a henhouse with a dozen chickens that needed tending every morning regardless of the weather. Cobb arrived at 7 on the first morning, a wiry man in his late 40s with a face like a piece of old tack leather, and a manner that was so quiet it took Ellen several days to realize he was not actually taciturn, but simply unhurried. He nodded at her introduction without visible surprise, accepted that she was there with the same equanimity with which he appeared to accept everything, and put her to work. She fed the chickens. She hauled water. She helped in the kitchen, because the cooking on the ranch had apparently been Albert's responsibility since the previous spring, when the woman who had been cooking for him had left to join her daughter's family in Oregon. And while Albert could produce a perfectly functional stew and a competent biscuit, his range was limited. Ellen's mother had been an excellent cook and had taught her daughter thoroughly, and on the second day at the Hartwell Ranch, Ellen made a proper beef pie with the pastry crust and a pot of dried apple preserves from the cellar stores, and watched Albert Hartwell take his first bite with the careful neutrality of a man trying not to show how pleased he was, and then watched him take 3 more helpings. "That's good," he said, which she was beginning to understand was the equivalent from him of considerable praise. She began to settle into the rhythms of the place. The days were long and physical and cold, and she fell into bed each night tired in a way that was entirely different from the exhausted despair of Cutter's Creek. This was the tiredness of work done, of something accomplished. She learned where the tools were kept, and where the feed was stored, and which of the horses would try to nip if you approached from the left, and which of the chickens was the bully of the henhouse. She learned that Albert rose at 5 every morning and always made the coffee himself before anything else, that he read every evening without fail, and that he played a harmonica badly but with tremendous sincerity when he thought no one could hear him. She heard him on the 4th evening, sitting in his rocking chair while she was reading in her room with the door slightly ajar, and she pressed her lips together against a smile and said nothing. The winter deepened. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that required a person to move from building to building quickly and purposefully, never lingering in the open air. The passes filled with snow, and the ranch became its own small world, self-contained and quiet. Cobb made it up from his place each morning with a reliability that impressed Ellen, though he acknowledged her increasing admiration with nothing more than a slight nod, and the observation that a man who let a little snow stop him was a man who would not last long in the territory. She and Albert fell into conversation gradually, the way people do when they are confined to close quarters through no particular contrivance, and there is nothing to do in the evenings but talk or be silent. The silence was comfortable, which surprised her. She was not accustomed to comfortable silence with anyone except her mother, and even then it had required years of familiarity to achieve. But Albert Hartwell seemed entirely at peace with the absence of words, which paradoxically made her want to fill it more than she might have otherwise. She learned that he was 34 years old, that he had come to Montana from western Pennsylvania when he was 19, that he had worked for 2 other ranchers before acquiring this land through what he described only as hard work and careful management, and that he had been on this particular piece of ground for 8 years. She learned that he had a sister in Pennsylvania whom he wrote to regularly, and that his parents had both died some years back. She learned that he had taught himself to read as a boy from a neighbor's Bible, and had since developed a genuine appetite for books that was somewhat constrained by the difficulty of getting them to a ranch 40 miles from the nearest town. "I brought books," she said one evening, which was not entirely accurate. She had brought 2 books, one being the Bible but the other being a novel, a somewhat battered copy of a work by a British author that she had bought in Cincinnati for the journey and had not yet finished. She produced it from her case and set it on the table. He looked at it for a moment. "Can I read it when you're done?" "You can read it now," she said. "I've read it twice before." He picked it up and read the first paragraph standing at the table, and she watched his face change slightly, a subtle softening of the set of his features that she was beginning to recognize as his version of evident pleasure. "Sit down," she said, and he did, and they spent that evening on opposite sides of the fire reading. It was not a courtship yet. She was honest with herself about that. She was a woman who had come to this ranch with nothing, and was being housed and paid wages by its owner, and the last thing she intended to do was complicate that with sentiments that had not been invited. She was practical by nature, and had been made more so by the events of the past 2 months. Whatever she felt when Albert looked at her with those direct, attentive eyes, whatever warmth gathered in her chest when he said, "That's good," about her cooking, or "You've got a good hand with the horses," about her work in the barn, she put carefully to one side and left it there. He, for his part, was equally careful. He was respectful in a way that she recognized as the result of genuine principle rather than mere social habit. He never crowded her, never presumed, never let his eyes linger. He gave her space in the house and dignity in her work, and did not treat her as the ruined woman that Cutter's Creek had decided she was. He treated her as a person doing a job, which was exactly what she was, and exactly what she needed. But the winter was long and the house was warm, and they were 2 people who had each, for different reasons, been alone for a considerable time. The first crack appeared in December. Cobb had been unable to make it up from his place for 3 days due to a particularly brutal snowfall, and Ellen and Albert were managing the ranch between them alone. The work was harder without him. There were always cattle to check on, feed to distribute, ice to break on the water troughs, and they were out in the fields together for the better part of each day. On the third afternoon, one of the cattle, a young heifer, had gotten herself caught in a tangle of fencing wire in the far pasture and was in considerable distress by the time they found her. It took them the better part of an hour, working together in the late afternoon dark with fingers that had gone numb and a heifer that was frightened and thrashing, to get her free. When they finally had her loose and she trotted off unhurt into the herd, Ellen sat down in the snow because her legs had decided they had done enough for the day, and Albert sat down next to her, which she had not expected, and they were both breathing hard and their breath rose in visible clouds in the cold air, and she started to laugh. She did not entirely know why. It might have been the relief of the heifer being all right, or the absurdity of sitting in a Montana snowfield in the dark, or simply 6 weeks of held tension finally finding a small exit. But she started laughing, and once she started she found she could not easily stop. And after a moment Albert Hartwell, who she had not yet heard laugh, made a sound that started low and grew into something genuine and warm, and they sat there in the snow laughing together until they were both wiped out and breathless. He helped her up, taking her hand to pull her to her feet, and then he did not immediately release it. It was only a moment, perhaps 2 seconds, before he let go, but she felt it with the same clarity that she would have felt a crack of thunder. They walked back to the house in the dark, and neither of them said anything about it. But the careful equilibrium shifted slightly after that, tilted almost imperceptibly toward something else. She noticed that he looked for her when he came in from the cold, a quick scanning of the room until he found her that she doubted he was entirely aware of. She noticed that his suggestions about the work had taken on a quality of explanation rather than direction, as though he wanted her to understand the reasoning rather than merely comply with the instruction. She noticed that the harmonica playing had moved from the evenings when he thought she was asleep to the evenings when he knew she was in the next room, which was not, she thought, an accident. She noticed all of this and she still did not reach for it, because the situation was precarious and she was not a foolish woman. Cobb noticed too. Cobb was not a man who commented on things that were not his business, but one morning in mid-December when Ellen was in the barn and Albert was out checking the north pasture fence, Cobb paused in his work, gave her a long sideways look and said without preamble, "He's a good man." "I know," Ellen said. "Never knew him to have anyone up here who suited the place the way you do," Cobb said, and then went back to his work as though he had not said anything at all. She thought about that for several days. The letter arrived in mid-December. Cobb brought it up with him on one of the clear days when he had stopped in town on his way, a letter addressed to Albert in a neat feminine hand that Albert read at the table after supper while Ellen cleared the dishes. She was not watching him read it, but she could not entirely avoid noticing that his expression shifted as he turned the pages, settling into something that was difficult to read. "My sister," he said, without looking up. "She's asking when I'm going to get married." Ellen kept washing the bowl in her hands. "What do you tell her?" "The same thing I always tell her," he said. He folded the letter and set it on the shelf. "That I'm thinking about it." She set the bowl on the drying rack. "That seems like a reasonable thing to think about." He looked at her then, and there was a directness in the look that was beyond even his usual directness, something with more weight behind it, and Ellen Hurst held his gaze and did not look away, and something passed between them that had the quality of an understanding reached without a single word being spoken. Then Albert Hartwell said, "Good night, Ellen," and she said, "Good night, Albert," and they each went to their respective ends of the house, and nothing further was said, but the air in the house had changed in a way that they both knew and neither was ready to address quite yet. Christmas came to the Hartwell Ranch with a particular quality of stillness. It was 32 degrees below zero on the 25th of December, a cold so profound and total that the trees cracked in the night like rifle shots. Cobb had gone to spend the week with his daughter's family in the valley, and the ranch was Ellen and Albert's alone. She had used a portion of her wages. Albert paid her $1 a week, which was fair for a ranch hand and generous for a woman in 1882, to get a few things from the store on the last trip anyone made into town before the passes closed for what was likely to be most of the winter. She had flour and sugar and a small quantity of dried cranberries, and she had made a proper cake that morning, modest but real, and set it in the center of the table. Albert came in from the morning chores and stopped when he saw it. He looked at the cake and then at her and then at the cake again. "I haven't had a Christmas cake since I was a boy," he said. "Then we're overdue," she said. He had wrapped a gift for her too, which she had not expected. It was a pair of good leather gloves, lined with wool, sized for a woman's hands, which meant he had taken note of the size of her hands at some point, and the consideration of that hit her somewhere in the chest with a force that she was not fully prepared for. She put them on immediately and flexed her fingers, and the leather was soft, and the warmth was immediate, and she looked up at him, and he was watching her with an expression that he was no longer entirely disguising. "Thank you," she said. "They were practical," he said, which was the most Albert Hartwell way of expressing genuine feeling that she had yet encountered, and she loved it, she realized. She loved the specificity of him. That thought arrived with a clarity that startled her. She put it in her pocket carefully and kept it there while they ate the cake and drank coffee and the fire burned, and the temperature outside dropped further, and the house held them both in its warmth against all of that cold. January brought a thaw, brief and deceptive, followed by a freeze that was harder than anything before it. It also brought trouble in the form of a man named Gus Merrill, who arrived at the ranch gate on a gray morning riding a horse that had been ridden too hard and too far. Merrill was a rider for a large cattle outfit to the south called the Pendleton Operation, a company concern that had been buying up land across the territory with the kind of aggressive single-mindedness that small ranchers understood to mean eventual pressure. He was polite in the way of men who are delivering an impolite message. He told Albert, standing at the table with his hat in his hands while Ellen stood at the stove and did not pretend not to listen, that the Pendleton Operation was interested in acquiring the Hartwell grazing rights on the eastern section of the ranch, the section that bordered the creek, where Albert's cattle watered. He named a figure that was, he said, very generous. Albert listened to all of this without expression. Then he said, "No." Merrill said the offer would not remain open indefinitely. Albert said, "I know how these offers work." Merrill looked at Ellen. He looked back at Albert. He said, with the particular kind of meaning that men put into words that are not the actual words, "A man alone out here might find the offer more reasonable in spring when the situation can be properly reassessed." The pause before reassessed carried enough weight to fill a room. Ellen felt the back of her neck prickle, and she kept her face composed and her hands steady on the stove. Albert's voice when he spoke had gone very quiet and very flat. "The situation," he said, "is not one I'm confused about. The ranch is not for sale. The grazing rights are not for sale. This conversation is done. I'll ask you to ride back the way you came." Merrill put on his hat and left. They listened to the sound of his horse's hooves recede across the frozen ground. Ellen turned from the stove. Albert was standing with his hands flat on the table looking at the door. "He'll be back," she said. "Or someone like him," he agreed. He looked at her. "Does that concern you?" She considered this honestly. "Yes," she said, "but not enough to change anything." Something in his face shifted very quietly, like a key turning in a lock that had been stiff for a long time. The Pendleton issue simmered through the following weeks. There were no more direct visits, but Cobb came up in late January with word that the operation had been making inquiries in town about Albert's situation, his finances, his land deed, his standing. It was the kind of background pressure that was meant to be felt without being directly confronted. Albert responded to this by doing exactly what he always did, rising at 5, making the coffee, going out to his land and working it. Ellen began to take on more of the bookkeeping, a task that Albert had never been disorganized about but had not found time to keep properly current during the busy winter. She had a good head for figures, inherited from her mother who had kept the family's modest accounts, with the precision of someone who knew that the difference between solvent and not solvent was often a matter of careful arithmetic. She went through the ranch ledgers and the land deed and the grazing agreements, and made a clear accounting of the ranch's financial position, which turned out to be significantly stronger than the Pendleton operations inquiries were apparently suggesting. She presented it to Albert one evening at the table and walked him through the figures, and he listened and looked at the columns she had organized and said, after a moment, "You're very good at this." "My mother kept accounts," she said. "She taught me it was the most important skill a woman could have, the ability to know exactly where you stand." He looked at her over the papers for a moment. "Do you always know where you stand?" It was a question with more than one meaning, and they both knew it. She met his eyes. "I'm working on it," she said, and something that might have been a smile moved across his face. The spring came late to the gray wall, as it always did, which Cobb told her meant April before the snow retreated to the high elevations, and the creek ran clear, and the kitchen garden could be turned. Ellen spent the early spring days learning the garden, finding where things had been planted the previous year from the evidence of the beds, planning what she would put in and where. She had not precisely been given authority over the garden, but Albert did not tend it himself and Cobb had no interest in it, and so she claimed it the way she had been quietly claiming pieces of the ranch all winter, not by declaration, but by simply showing up and doing the work. One morning in early March, Albert came to stand beside her where she was turning the first bed with a spade, and he watched her work for a moment and then said, "You're planning to stay." It was not a question, but she answered it as one. "If that's all right." "It's more than all right," he said, and his voice had a roughness in it that she recognized as emotion kept under close governance. "Ellen," he stopped. She leaned on the spade and looked at him. The morning was bright and cold, and the snow was still on the peaks above them, and the air smelled of cold water and pine and turned earth. "I'm not good at saying things," he said. He stopped again. Then, with the effort of a man who has spent years making his words carry weight because he uses so few of them, "I would like very much to know if you think there is, if you believe that we might." He looked genuinely pained by his own inadequacy with language, and it was so uncharacteristic of his usual composed competence that Ellen set the spade against the fence post and faced him fully and said, clearly and without making him finish the sentence, "Yes, Albert, I do." He looked at her for a moment as though confirming that she meant what he thought she meant. Then he nodded once slowly, and the relief in his eyes was enormous. "Good," he said. And then, because he was Albert Hartwell, "Good." She started laughing, and this time he laughed immediately, right away, not the slow-building surprise of the snowfield in November, but easy and warm, and she reached up and put her hand on the side of his face, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood in the kitchen garden in the cold morning light, and it was absolutely sufficient. He courted her with a thoroughness and seriousness that she found wonderful. He brought her the books that Cobb periodically collected from town on his behalf, presenting them with a slight formality that told her he had thought carefully about the choice. He asked about Cincinnati and about her mother with genuine interest, and she told him things she had not told anyone in months, and the telling felt like setting down weight she had been carrying so long she had forgotten she was carrying it. He took her riding on the good days, showing her the farthest edges of the ranch, the places he was proudest of, a stand of aspens along the creek that turned gold in autumn, a high meadow where the horses ran when the summer was warm enough, a view from the eastern ridge that on clear days extended what seemed like 100 miles south into a landscape so large and so beautiful it made the size of the world feel like a gift rather than a threat. She told him on one of those rides in late March about what it had been like to stand in the street in Cutter's Creek and be declared ruined. She told it plainly, looking at the mountains, and when she finished he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "The only ruination in that street was in the man who laughed." She looked at him. "It doesn't bother you what people in town say about it." "I know what you are," he said. "That's the beginning and end of what matters to me." She had to look away then because the backs of her eyes were doing the thing she did not allow in front of other people. April arrived, and with it, the first serious trouble from the Pendleton operation. 3 of Albert's cattle were found at the far southern end of the east pasture, with their brands altered clumsily, recently, and very obviously with intent to suggest they were strays from the Pendleton herd. It was a crude and fairly transparent attempt to establish a claim, but in the territory in 1882, disputes over cattle could escalate rapidly, and the law was thin and unevenly applied. Albert rode to town and filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office and the Marshal's office. The Marshal was a man named Colby who, Ellen gathered, from Albert's careful description of him, was not corrupt exactly, but was susceptible to the kind of pressure that large operations could apply. He came out to the ranch and looked at the cattle and wrote something in his book and said he would look into it, with an air of a man who had a fairly well-developed sense of how these things resolved. It was Cobb who suggested the practical solution. "You want to make this complicated for Pendleton," Cobb said one evening at the table. "You want witnesses. People who have been here long enough to know the cattle and can say clearly what the brands looked like before somebody got at them with a hot iron." Albert looked at him. "Who would you suggest?" Cobb looked at his coffee. "I would. There's also old Harmon at the South Valley, been running cattle alongside yours for 6 years. And he paused. "There's the matter of your land deed. You've had it looked at by a lawyer." Ellen looked up from the accounts ledger she had been working on. "The deed is clean," she said. "I went through it thoroughly. Every page is in order. But if Pendleton has any kind of territorial political connection, the strength of the deed depends on whether the land office backs it." They both looked at her. She set down her pen. "What you need is a lawyer in Helena who can put a formal opinion on record. That creates a paper trail that's harder to work around even with political pressure." She paused. "I wrote out the figures last month. The ranch can support the cost of a lawyer's fee this season." Albert was looking at her with that particular expression that she recognized by now as the one that appeared when she did something that confirmed something he already believed, and he said, "Helena is 3 days' ride in good weather." "Yes," she said, "but worth doing." He went in April, taking Cobb with him, and Ellen ran the ranch for 4 days with the help of a young man from the South Valley named Peters who was 17 and enthusiastic if not experienced, and she managed it without incident. And when Albert came back with a formal legal opinion, and the opinion of a land advocate who had reviewed the deed and declared it sound, the relief he came through the door with was visible, and she met him in the middle of the main room, and he put his arms around her for the first time and held on for a long moment, and she pressed her face into the warmth of his coat and let him. "Everything all right here?" he said into the top of her head. "Everything is exactly as you left it," she said. He stepped back and looked at her face carefully as though checking. Then he said, "I have a question I've been building up to ask." "Then ask it." "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "And I want to say clearly that I'm not asking because the ranch needs a woman to run it, though you run it better than I do in several respects. I'm asking because the past 4 months have been the best months I can remember in a long time, and that's entirely because you're in them, and I would like every subsequent month to be the same." Ellen looked at him for a moment and felt the full weight of everything that had happened since she stepped off the stagecoach in Cutter's Creek. The humiliation and the cold and the fire and the 2-day walk through the snow and the bowl of stew and the gloves and the kitchen garden and the rides to the eastern ridge and all of it. And she said, "Yes, I'm asking the same of you, so we're agreed." He smiled, and it was the fullest smile she had yet seen from him, changing his whole face, and he said, "We're agreed." And then he kissed her, which was long and thorough and accomplished with the same careful, focused attention that he brought to everything. They were married in May at the ranch, on a day when the snow had finally retreated to the highest peaks, and the aspens along the creek were putting out their new leaves, and the sky was the particular saturated blue that appears in Montana in the spring, as though it is making up for lost time. The ceremony was performed by a traveling minister who passed through the territory twice a year, and who stayed for supper afterward and ate 3 helpings of Ellen's beef pie, and declared it the finest meal he had had since Missoula. Cobb served as witness, standing at Albert's side with his hat in his hands and an expression of quiet satisfaction that was, for Cobb, equivalent to beaming. A handful of neighboring ranchers and their families came out for it. People Ellen had been gradually meeting over the spring months as the weather permitted: the Harmons from the South Valley, the Riley family from the east, a widow named Mrs. Crane who ran a small homestead on her own with a capability that Ellen found deeply admirable. They brought food and a fiddle player, and the evening extended well past dark, the fire in the yard keeping the spring chill at bay, and the fiddle player working through everything he knew twice. Ellen danced with Albert, which was revelatory. He was not a man she would have expected to dance well, but he was steady and deliberate and guided her with a sureness that she supposed she should not have been surprised by, since it was how he did everything. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked. "Pennsylvania," he said. "There was a woman down the road who believed it was essential to civilization and organized lessons for all the young people in the valley. I thought it was nonsense at the time. And now," he looked down at her, "useful thing to know." She laughed, and he turned her in a circle, and the fire threw their shadows long across the yard, and the fiddle played on. The Pendleton issue resolved itself in summer, not dramatically but conclusively. The legal opinion from Helena and a formal letter from a land advocate citing chapter and precedent apparently gave the operations attorneys enough pause to redirect their expansion efforts elsewhere. There was no confrontation, no final scene. One day the pressure was there, and the next it had moved on to some other piece of land, leaving the Hartwell Ranch intact and unencumbered. It was, Albert said, exactly how he had expected it to go. "I knew they wouldn't push past the legal obstacle," he said. "How?" Ellen asked. "Because they're a company operation. They want profit with manageable risk. I just needed to make the risk less manageable. The figures I put together," she said. "The figures you put together were part of it," he agreed. He did not add anything else, but he looked at her with the particular directness that she now understood fully, that had no guardedness in it at all, and she felt warm down to her bones. Summer on the ranch was extraordinary. This was the revelation that she had not quite anticipated. She had understood the ranch in its winter severity and its spring urgency, but she had not understood how beautiful it became when the temperature rose and the high meadow bloomed, and the horses ran loose on the long evenings when the sky did not darken fully until nearly 10 at night. She spent the summer learning things she had never imagined needing to know: how to read the weather from the behavior of the horses, how to doctor a cow with a minor injury, how to build a proper fire in the open air, how to find her way back to the ranch from any of the high trails by reading the creek drainage and the angle of the peaks. Albert taught her all of this with the same unhurried seriousness with which he did everything, as though her knowing the land was a thing he considered important in itself, not just useful. She understood after a while that this was how he expressed love: by sharing his knowledge, by including her in the world he had built, by treating her competence as something worth developing. She expressed it differently. She expressed it in the meals she put on the table, and the accounts she kept current, and the letters she helped him draft to his sister in Pennsylvania, who had written back to their marriage announcement with a warmth and delight that made Ellen feel welcomed into a family she had not expected to have. She expressed it in the evenings when they sat by the fire with their books, her feet tucked under her in the rocking chair that she had quietly claimed as her own, and the harmonica had moved to Sunday afternoons on the porch, no longer pretending to be private, and she had told him plainly that she loved hearing it, which had produced a silence followed by a resumption of playing that was, she thought, slightly more confident than before. She expressed it once on a late summer evening when they were sitting on the porch watching the light change on the peaks by saying, I am so grateful that I knocked on your door." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I am so grateful that you knocked." She took his hand and they sat watching the sun go down behind the gray wall, and it was absolutely enough and more. In September, Ellen realized she was expecting a child. She told Albert on a Tuesday evening after supper, sitting across the table from him, and watched his face go through a sequence of expressions that was, for the normally composed Albert Hartwell, almost comical in its openness, surprise, then something that was pure unguarded joy, then a kind of careful, immediate concern. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Well," she said, "I feel well." "Good." He was still looking at her with the joy barely contained behind the concern, and she reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Albert, I feel well. This is good news." "Yes," he said, and the smile broke through completely. "Yes, it is." Cobb told the following morning, said and then went back to his work, and then, about an hour later, appeared in the kitchen with a very fine piece of cured venison that he said he had happened to bring extra of that day, and set it on the table without further comment, which Ellen understood as congratulation and received accordingly. The pregnancy was straightforward through autumn and into the second winter, which was nowhere near as brutal as the first had been, though still cold enough to make the horses stamp, and the fire necessary by 4 in the afternoon. Ellen modified her work accordingly, doing less of the outdoor hauling and more of the indoor management, and Albert was attentive without being overbearing, which she appreciated enormously. He had the gift of understanding what she needed without requiring her to perform helplessness to get it. Mrs. Crane from the neighboring homestead became a frequent visitor during those months, a practical woman in her 50s who had considerable experience with childbirth, and offered her knowledge without sentimentality, which Ellen found far more useful than sentimentality would have been. Mrs. Crane came out in February when the time came, along with the wife of the nearest neighboring rancher, a kind woman named Mrs. Harmon, who brought bread and tea and kept the fire built up. And on the 9th of February, 1883, after a labor that was difficult in the way that first labors are difficult, long and demanding, and requiring more from a person than they anticipated, Ellen and Albert Hartwell's son was born. He was a large, dark-haired boy who announced his arrival with considerable force and looked, in Albert's arms in the immediate minutes afterward, like an entity of absolute seriousness that was taking a highly critical view of everything he saw. Albert held him with a care so concentrated it was almost painful to observe. The enormous careful hands that had pulled a heifer free of wire and built fences in a Montana winter, and held a lantern at the door for a woman stumbling in from a snowstorm, holding his son as though the boy was the most extraordinary thing in the territory. Ellen watched him from the bed, exhausted and entirely present, and felt something so large and complete inside her that it had no name she knew of, or perhaps it was the name love but grown to a size that made the word feel inadequate. "What are we going to call him?" Albert said. She had thought about this. "I'd like to call him John," she said. "After your father, if that's all right." Albert looked at her over the boy's head. His jaw moved very slightly. He looked back at the boy. "John Hartwell," he said. "Yes." Spring came again, and John Hartwell grew with a speed that seemed impossible to reconcile with having been a person who recently fit in one arm. He had his father's eyes and his mother's determined chin, and a fundamental seriousness of expression that made people who met him smile reflexively, because there is something irresistible about a very small person looking at the world with such concentrated gravity. The ranch expanded that year. Albert had been considering for some time increasing the horse breeding operation, which had a market that the cattle did not, being more specialized and better priced. With the land secured and the financial picture that Ellen had helped clarify, it was feasible. They brought in 2 additional mares of good mountain stock in the spring, and a stallion that Albert had been in correspondence about for the better part of a year, a gray animal of considerable character that John, at 3 months, regarded from a safe distance in his mother's arms with what appeared to be professional interest. Cobb took on an apprentice that year too, a young man of 19 named Thomas, whose family had recently come to the territory from Kansas, and who had the quality that Cobb described as useful, meaning he worked hard, listened more than he talked, and learned quickly. He became a permanent fixture on the ranch, boarding in the bunkhouse that Albert had built at the south end of the property, and the operation settled into its expanded form with the naturalness of something that had always been meant to be this size. The letter from Douglas Fenwick came in the summer of 1883. Ellen opened it, which surprised her, because she had not expected him to know where she was or to write. It was brief. He had heard she had married and was established on a ranch in the north of the territory. He wished her the phrasing was awkward, the writing of a man who was performing a courtesy he had been told he owed well. She read it once, set it on the table, and went back to the kitchen garden, where she was harvesting the first of the season's beans. Albert found the letter when he came in for his midday meal. He read it and set it back on the table without comment, and then he looked at her through the kitchen window where she was visible working in the garden, and she looked up and met his eyes through the glass, and she shook her head slightly to indicate that it did not matter, and he nodded, and that was the end of Douglas Fenwick. She wrote to Mr. and Mrs. Fenn that year. It took considerable effort to track down their whereabouts, but through a chain of correspondence and a contact that Mrs. Crane knew in a neighboring territory, she eventually found an address in California where they had reestablished themselves. She wrote them a proper letter, telling them where she was and how she had come to be there, thanking them for the note that had led her to the Hartwell Ranch, telling them about Albert and John and the ranch and the kitchen garden and the horses. She told them that what had been done to them in Cutter's Creek was wrong and that she thought about them and hoped they were well. The reply came 3 months later, a neat letter in Mrs. Fenn's careful hand. They were well. They had opened a new laundry in Sacramento and it was prospering. Mr. Fenn had sent his own particular congratulations and the observation, which he had always held, that people generally found their way to where they were supposed to be. Mrs. Fenn had included a small gift of dried tea, the best she could source, and her warmest wishes for the child. Ellen read the letter 3 times and put it in the box where she kept the things that mattered. The second pregnancy came in the autumn of 1883, and this time Ellen knew what to expect from the process, if not the result. She felt well through most of it, better than the first time, and the ranch in the autumn was so beautiful. The aspens along the creek turning gold exactly as Albert had promised that first spring, the sky that deep clear blue, the light low and warm in the late afternoons, that she felt the season and the state of her body as things that matched each other, full of the same quality of contained abundance. Albert's sister, Margaret, came from Pennsylvania for the birth. She was 30 years old, unmarried and apparently fully satisfied with that state, practical and funny in a way that surprised Ellen, who had built a mental picture of her from the letters, and had not quite captured the reality. Margaret arrived in October with a single large trunk, and an attitude toward the territory that was somewhere between genuine delight and the amusement of someone who finds extremity entertaining. "My brother did not describe you accurately," Margaret said on the first day. "How did he describe me?" Ellen asked. "Capable," Margaret said, "which is true but insufficient." She looked around the main room of the house, at the books on the shelves and the accounts ledger open on the table and the warmth of the fire and little John sitting on the bearskin rug with the focused intensity of a child discovering that stacking objects is a discipline requiring concentration. "He didn't say that you made the place feel lived in." "He made the place," Ellen said. "I just made it a home," Margaret said. "That's different. He knows the difference." The baby came in November, a smaller and quieter arrival than John had been, a girl this time who came into the world with a kind of thoughtful steadiness that seemed to bode well for her character. They named her Clara Margaret, the second name for Albert's sister, who received this with a briskness that did not quite conceal that she was deeply moved. Albert held Clara in the same concentrated, careful way he had held John, but this time Ellen saw him smile at the baby immediately, a soft and entirely unguarded smile, and Clara seemed to consider this information before arriving at a similar expression on her own very small face, and the entire thing was almost more than Ellen could accommodate. Margaret stayed through the winter, which was a gift that Ellen had not fully anticipated needing. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was harsh again, and managing a ranch and a nursing infant, and a toddler with two capable adults rather than one made a practical difference. But more than that, Margaret was company of a kind Ellen had not had since Cincinnati. They talked in the evenings after the children were down, real conversations, the kind that move across many things and circle back and go places that surprise you. Margaret was educated and opinionated and genuinely interested, and she asked Ellen questions about her life before the ranch, about Cincinnati, about her mother, about what she had wanted before circumstances had redirected everything. "What did you want?" Margaret asked one evening, before all of it. Ellen considered this honestly. "I wanted to be useful," she said, "and I wanted to be known, not famous, not admired particularly, just to be known by someone who chose to know me." Margaret looked at her. And I have both," Ellen said, "more than I imagined they could look like." In spring, Margaret went back to Pennsylvania. The goodbye was the kind that looks ahead rather than back, full of promises about letters and visits that they both intended to keep, and did. Albert stood at the gate and watched his sister's wagon until it was out of sight, and then he came back to the house where Ellen was standing at the kitchen window with Clara on her hip, and he came to her and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and John, who was by then 14 months old and mobile and busy, came and sat on Albert's boot the way he had recently discovered he could do when Albert stood still long enough. Albert looked down at his son on his boot and then at his daughter against his wife's hip and then at his wife's face and said, very quietly, "Look what we built." "Look what we built," she agreed. The years that followed on the Hartwell Ranch had the quality of good, full time. There were hard years and there were easy years. There were seasons of struggle and seasons of abundance, and through all of them the ranch grew and changed, and the family at its center grew and changed with it. The horse breeding became the primary enterprise by the mid-1880s, as Albert had anticipated, the Hartwell Mountain horses developing a reputation across the territory that brought buyers from considerable distances, and established the ranch's name in a way that no amount of political pressure could easily threaten. John grew into a boy who was his father's shadow from the moment he could walk independently, following Albert through the work of the ranch with the intense observation of a child who is learning everything and knows it. He had the same directness, the same economy of movement, but Ellen's stubbornness and her way with figures, which became apparent early, and gave Albert a visible satisfaction whenever it manifested. Clara was something else entirely, neither her father's quiet nor her mother's practical pragmatism, but some third thing, brighter and faster and more interested in everything than both of them, asking questions with a speed that required two adults to keep up with. Mrs. Harmon said she would be a handful, and Albert said he was counting on it, and Ellen looked at her daughter and felt the particular love of recognizing yourself in someone and also someone entirely beyond you. Cobb was there through all of it, a constant at the morning gate, a quiet anchor. He retired from the heavy work in 1886 when his hip began to make the outdoor winters painful, but he remained a regular presence, coming up 3 days a week to manage the horses and supervise Thomas, who by then ran the daily operations with a competence that had long since outpaced the apprentice designation and required a proper partnership agreement, which Albert executed in 1885 with the fairness that characterized everything he did. The matter of Cutter's Creek resolved itself, as small shameful things sometimes do, through time and consequence. Douglas Fenwick. Ellen heard through the loose channels of territory gossip that Cobb occasionally brought up with him, had left the territory by 1884, the enterprise he had been building having proved less successful than his confidence had suggested. The town of Cutter's Creek itself had contracted rather than grown, a fate shared by many towns that had been built on the expectation of a mining surge that did not materialize. It was not a satisfying resolution in any dramatic sense. It was simply the ordinary reckoning of ordinary choices. Ellen did not feel satisfaction at hearing this news. She felt something closer to a settled distance from it, the way you feel about whether that was terrible a long time ago, real in memory, no longer present in body. In the summer of 1886, on the occasion of their 4th wedding anniversary, Albert asked Ellen if she wanted to go to Helena, not for legal business or ranch affairs, but simply to go. She looked at him for a moment. "A trip," she said. "A trip," he confirmed. "Thomas can manage the horses. Cobb will be here. Mrs. Harmon has offered before to have the children if we ever. The children would be fine for a few days." Ellen considered the last 4 years of ranch mornings and ranch evenings, and the inside of the main house and the kitchen garden and the view from the eastern ridge and all of it beautiful and real and entirely hers, and said, "Yes, let's go to Helena." They left the children with the Harmons, who received them with the warmth of people who have been waiting for their neighbors to do something impractical, and rode to Helena in 3 days and stayed at a proper hotel for 4 nights. Ellen had not been in a city since Cincinnati, and the scale and speed of Helena, which was not, by any standard outside the territory, a large city, felt like a kind of recalibration of the senses. She walked through the streets with Albert beside her, and looked at the shop windows and the buildings and the people, and she thought about the woman who had arrived in Cutter's Creek with $3.40 and a leather case, and the distance between that woman and this one felt both enormous and entirely comprehensible, each step visible and real. Albert bought her a proper dress, a thing he clearly found more difficult to navigate than any ranch emergency, standing in the dry goods store with the expression of a man in unfamiliar terrain, and she helped him choose, and he paid for it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been wanting to do this for a long time and is finally doing it. She wore it to the restaurant on their last evening, and he looked at her across the table with the same directness he had across the table in the main room of the ranch on the first night, but so different, so much more present, so full of history and knowledge, and the specific gravity of a love that had been built rather than fallen into. "That first night," he said, not needing to specify which first night, "when you knocked, when you opened the door," she said, "I looked at you standing in the snow," he said, "and I thought, that is a person who is not going to let this place defeat her. I thought," she said, "that your house was the warmest place in the world." "It is," he said simply. She reached across the table and took his hand, and they were in a restaurant in Helena in 1886, and the room was full of other people, and the candles on the table made the light golden, and she was not the ruined woman who had walked out of Cutter's Creek, and she was not the hopeful woman who had arrived in the territory expecting a different life than the one she got, and she was entirely and completely herself here, in this, with him. They rode home through the September mountains, through the particular quality of late summer on the high trails where the light was long and amber, and the aspen leaves were just beginning to think about turning, and Albert rode beside her, and they talked or were quiet by turns, and the horses were steady on the mountain trail, and the gray wall stood above them as it always stood, permanent and indifferent in the best way, reminding you of what endures. They came home to the ranch gate in the late afternoon of the 4th day, and John came running from the Harmon place, where he had apparently been watching the trail for the better part of the day, and Clara came behind him at her own pace, which was already characteristically unhurried by anything except genuine interest, and Albert swung down from his horse and caught his son in midair, and Ellen was off her horse and had Clara against her before the dust settled. And she smelled the top of Clara's head, and John was telling his father something about a horse at a tremendous speed, and Cobb was coming from the barn with his slow, hip-sore walk and the expression that was his version of everything being right, and Thomas was lifting their bags from the horses with the easy efficiency of a young man who had grown into the place. And the kitchen garden was there, somewhat overgrown in 4 days of absence, needing attention, and the aspen trees along the creek were gold, exactly as Albert had promised on that spring ride 4 years ago, and the house behind all of it had smoke rising from the chimney because Mrs. Harmon had thought to go in ahead of them and build the fire. And the warmth would be there when they walked in. Ellen Hurst, Ellen Hartwell, stood in the yard of the ranch at the base of the gray wall on a September afternoon in 1886, with her daughter in her arms and her husband laughing at something their son was telling him, and the smell of turned earth and cold water and pine in the air. And she thought about a night 4 years ago when she had walked in from the snow, and a man had said 4 words to her that had, without either of them knowing it at the time, changed the entire direction of everything. Sit down and eat. She had sat down, she had eaten. She had explained when she was ready and been heard when she spoke and given work and wages and space, and in time something far larger than any of those things. She had been ruined, they had said, in Cutter's Creek. Ruined women did not get this. This was not what happened to a woman who had been made nothing in a street in front of strangers on a Tuesday afternoon. She looked at the mountains and the house and her children and her husband, who looked back at her over John's head with the full clear directness of his dark eyes, and she thought that the people of Cutter's Creek had been wrong about a good many things, but they had been most wrong about what ruination was. Ruination was not what had happened to her. Ruination was a word for an ending, and what had happened to her, all of it, every cold mile of it, had been the most complete and unlikely beginning. She walked into the house and the fire was going and the warmth came out to meet her at the door. Albert came in behind her with John on his shoulders and Clara toddling in ahead of them all, making immediately for the bearskin rug, where she kept a collection of smooth stones from the creek that she arranged and rearranged with the dedication of a person conducting important work. "I'll start supper," Ellen said. "I'll help," Albert said, setting John down and hanging up his coat. "You'll be in the way," she said, which was not entirely true. He was a capable hand in the kitchen by this point, 4 years of working alongside her having expanded his repertoire considerably beyond stew and biscuits. "I'll be company," he said, which was true and entirely sufficient. She moved to the stove and he came to stand beside her, and John was already at the door of the root cellar asking if he could get the potatoes, and Clara had arranged 3 stones to her apparent satisfaction and was regarding them with judicial calm. And outside the window the aspens were gold against the blue of the September sky, and the gray wall stood behind everything, permanent and present, and the smoke rose from the chimney of the Hartwell Ranch into the cold Montana air, visible for miles in every direction to anyone who happened to be lost in the dark and looking for a light, and if anyone knocked, the door would open. And there would be food on the table and warmth and someone who looked at you and saw what you were before you had said a word about it. And they would say, "Sit down, eat. You can explain when you're ready," and it would be enough. It would be more than enough. It would be everything.